My name is Armentano. I'm the Deputy Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I have been involved in the research and policy side of marijuana for over 20 years. I'm on faculty at Amsterdam University. I am the author of several books, including the book Marijuana is Safer, or Why Are We Driving People to Drink. My work has appeared in over 750 periodicals and over 24 textbooks and anthologies, and including in several peer-reviewed journals. I'm typically an expert witness in court. I was the principal investigator in U.S. v. Schweiter, which was the first federal evidentiary hearing to challenge the scheduling of cannabis since 1973. I was also a witness in the constitutional challenge in Canada known as Allard versus the Crown. That was a successful lawsuit, and the verdict in that case ruled that a patient's right to grow marijuana at home for their own medical needs is a right that is in line with fundamental justice. And I also conduct a number of continuing medical education seminars with regard to medical cannabis. Versions of those seminars are now mandated as curriculums for doctors in New York State and in Florida. So here I'm going to talk to you this morning about something that I think is really important, because when I listen to the dialogue that's taking place with regard to medical marijuana around the country, there seems to be one place where opponents of medical marijuana and proponents of medical marijuana, where their views kind of intersect. And it's on this notion that we just don't know enough about marijuana. We just don't have adequate studies with regard to medical marijuana to go ahead and change policy. And on the surface, this sounds reasonable. Again, we hear this almost day in and day out from our elected officials, from people of quite first weight. We have Hillary Clinton stumping in South Carolina late last fall, and she says, the problem with medical marijuana is we haven't done any research. None. Zero, apparently, in Ms. Clinton's mind. Mark Kleiman at UCLA said, I keep saying we just don't know enough about marijuana as we know, as Pillsbury knows about brownie mix. This was really interesting back and forth. Mark and I started with this dialogue. Mark made these statements, and then I answered in the Chicago Tribune, and I said, Mark, what is it we don't know about marijuana that we need to know that would satisfy you? Don't just say we don't know enough. Tell me what it is you don't think we know. And his response was to tell me to go fuck myself. So I still don't know what it is Mark wants to know about marijuana that he doesn't think we know. And again, we hear this from medical societies, and of course most recently we heard this from the DEA in their refusal to reschedule marijuana. They said there are no adequate and well-controlled studies that determine marijuana's medical efficacy. Zero. None. That's their position. So it's really interesting when you hear these claims over and over again from politicians, from bureaucrats, from medical societies, that we don't have any science about marijuana. None at all. Well, if that's the case, what the hell's all this? PubMed is the repository for all peer-reviewed scientific journal articles published anywhere in the world. You want to read the abstract, and in many cases the full text, of any scientific journal article, you simply go to PubMed, you do a keyword search, it comes up, you read it. If it's a scientific article published in a foreign journal in a foreign language, PubMed translates it into English, so you can read those journal articles as well. There should be absolutely no debate in this country right now about science or what scientific studies say with regard to virtually any topic, because you can readily, with keystrokes, access any peer-reviewed journal article that's ever been published through PubMed. You can do it through Medline, you can do it through other sources as well. So when you type in the word marijuana in the PubMed, what happens? Well, what happens is you don't get zero. You don't get no hits. In fact, when I did this a few weeks ago, putting these slides together, I got 23,951 specific journal articles that were published in PubMed or that were available on PubMed that were specific to cannabis. And when you do this, type in the word marijuana, because even within the international scientific community, marijuana is the word of choice. Now, to give this some context, Type in the word Tylenol. You get almost 20,000 peer-reviewed journal articles. That's a lot. That's a high volume of literature. But it is not the volume of literature we have specific to the marijuana plant. You type in ibuprofen. You don't even get half the total volume of published literature that we have about marijuana. You type in Ritalin, we don't even have a third of the literature. You type in hydrocodone, Vicodin, one of the most common analgesics prescribed. We don't even have 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles citing hydrocodone. And then we get down to Adderall. There's not even 200 published studies referencing Adderall. This doesn't mean there's not 200 studies specifically studying Adderall. There's not 200 published papers in the literature where the word Adderall even appears. Yet there is no national conversation taking place in this country where people say, you know what, we just don't know enough about Adderall. We just haven't subjected Adderall to adequate study. So why? Why do we hear this refrain about cannabis? If 24,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies aren't adequate, is there ever going to be an adequate number? I don't think so. And why are we letting our opponents define the terms of what's considered an adequate number? When again, when we look at this within the context of other therapeutic agents, we see that cannabis has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny than many of these conventional agents. Now, because we have this volume of literature pertaining to cannabis, we can answer a number of the core questions about cannabis, particularly questions pertaining to its safety and efficacy. Now, the word safe is an interesting term because oftentimes, again, when I sort of hear this national dialogue, I hear advocates, they make a mistake. They conflate the word safe with harmlessness or lack of potential risk. But when the FDA or any other regulatory body deems a therapeutic agent to be safe, they are clearly not defining that agent as without risk. Anyone in this room that's ever watched a 45-second ad spot for Levitra or Cymbalta or Lyrica, you name your prescription drug, knows that about half of that drug, or half of that television commercial, is spent with an outside narrator listing off the laundry list of adverse side effects that will occur or may occur when that drug is used as prescribed. That's important to note. These are the side effects, adverse side effects that may occur when the drug is used in a manner other than it was prescribed. This is what we expect to happen when the drug is used properly. And we know that one of the common side effects is risk of death by overdose. So clearly when the FDA deems a drug to be safe, they are not saying it is a drug that is without harm. So when we're talking about cannabis within this therapeutic context, it is not our burden to say that cannabis is without any risk whatsoever. Our burden is to assess how does cannabis measure up with regard to safety based on the societal standards that other conventional drugs are held to. And when we talk about cannabis within that filter, we see that cannabis is already established not to just be as safe, but in fact safer than many of the conventional medications it could replace, based on the same objective metrics those medications are judged by. And we see these results time and time again. We have even the DEA acknowledging, after 2 weeks of hearings in the mid-1980s on rescheduling, that marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. We have the National Academy of Sciences commissioned in 1996 to study. They took them 2.5 years to study the available literature at that time with regard to marijuana. And they said, look, we have some caution about the idea of patients inhaling combustive smoke. But if we take that stereotypical route of delivery out of the equation, on the spectrum of risks that we accept for other therapeutic agents, certainly the active compounds in marijuana are no greater than literally thousands of drugs, conventional drugs people use every day. We have a meta-analysis by Iverson in 2005 that says even if we were judging cannabis not by other medicinal substances, but even just recreational substances, we could make the objective case as a relatively safe drug. And we have a more recent meta-analysis by Sachs and colleagues saying, look, the health risks associated with cannabis are no more likely dangerous than other indulgences, including alcohol, nicotine, Tylenol, fried foods, downhill skiing. Again, it's not our burden to say necessarily that cannabis is safer than all these activities. It's not our burden to say that cannabis is without risk. It is our burden to establish that cannabis has an acceptable risk profile compared to these other therapeutics. So how do we assess that risk profile? If you were Merck or Eli Lilly, and you had a new drug you were trying to bring before FDA, the FDA wanted to determine if your drug met the societal standard of safety, what's the FDA going to ask you? Well, essentially they're going to ask you three questions. They're going to want to know what's the dependence liability of your drug, they're going to want to know what's the LD50 of your drug, and they're going to want to know what's the toxicity and risk of adverse side effects associated with your drug. And if you're Merck or Eli Lilly, you've got answers to those questions. And of course, if we're talking about cannabis in the therapeutic context, we have answers to those questions as well, because we have 24,000 studies specific to cannabis. In fact, we could answer a whole lot of other questions. And it's very interesting to me when I do a lot of these lectures, sometimes in far more hostile environments. I know what some of the other questions are. They'll ask questions like, what about the use of cannabis with pediatric patients? What about the use of cannabis with elderly patients that are suffering from mental illness? What about the use of cannabis in mothers who may be pregnant? These are all good, valid questions. We could have long theoretical discussions based on the data about those questions. But in many ways, those questions are all just a distraction. Because if we were Merck or Eli Lilly and we were going before the FDA, we would not be asked those questions. We wouldn't have to answer those questions. The FDA would not expect us, when we were doing our research and development of our new investigational drug, to test our drug on pediatric patients, to test our drug on pregnant women, to test our drug on geriatric patients with mental illness. We would never expose those patients to an investigational new drug. So the answer would be, I don't have the faintest idea how our drug interacts with those people. And that would be perfectly acceptable to the FDA. In fact, if the FDA said, how does your drug impact ethnic minorities? Are there side effects for Latinos that we don't see with white people? You'd say, I have no fucking idea. We don't have Latinos in our clinical studies. Because that's the truth. 1% of clinical trial subjects are Latino in this country. 5% are African American. About 9% are women. Okay? We don't know the effects of new drugs in huge swaths of this population until they are used by the population. We have a much better idea how cannabis affects the general population, because unlike these other substances, the general population historically for thousands of years has used cannabis. But with regard to the questions we need to answer, there's three: dependence liability, LD50, risk of adverse side effects. Dependence liability is not the same thing as addiction. Dependence liability refers to how likely is this person going to use this substance habitually. And there's about a 12 set of questions. And if you check off yes to about 3 of those questions, you meet the criteria for dependence liability. These include questions like, do you want to cut back on your drug use, but you struggle to do so? Do you find yourself craving the drug as it gets later in the day? Not surprisingly, people that drink caffeine tend to answer yes to lots of these questions. And not surprisingly, the dependence liability of cannabis is roughly the same dependence liability of caffeine. We see about 7% of the country check yes to enough of those questions to meet the criteria of dependence liability for caffeine. About 1 in 11 meet that criteria for cannabis. Same as anxiolytic drugs like your benzodiazepines. About twice as many people meet the dependence liability criteria for alcohol. More than a third meet dependence liability for tobacco. Again, I have some colleagues that take umbrage with this 9% dependence liability for cannabis. They think that percentage is too high. I say, fine, go to Harvard, have a debate about it. It is not my burden to say cannabis is without any dependence liability whatsoever. It is simply my burden to say that cannabis has an acceptable level of dependence liability. And clearly, it does. The next question the FDA is going to ask is, what's your LD50? LD50 stands for lethal dose in half. At what dosage will 50% of the subjects die from taking your drug at that dose? And if you're Merck or Eli Lilly, you've got a number to give them. Because when you began your R&D, you gave larger and larger doses of your drug to laboratory rats until 50% of them were dead. And then you extrapolated the lethal dose in rats to what would be the lethal dose in humans. And then you come up with your LD50. And based on your LD50, you come up with a safety ratio. This refers to the range between your ED50 and your LD50. Your ED50 is your effective dose in half. At what dosage will 50% of subjects experience a psychotropic effect from your drug? Versus at what dosage will 50% of the subjects die from taking your drug? And if you have a low LD50, you're going to have a very narrow range between your ED50 and your LD50. And if you're Merck or Eli Lilly and you want your drug to be approved, you want lots of people to use your drug, you want to have a wide range between the effective dose in half and the potentially lethal dose in half. But the reason we see accidental overdose associated with certain families of drugs, like the opioids, for instance, is because the opiates have low LD50s, which means there's not a whole lot of range between an effective dose and a potentially lethal dose. So here's a chart listing a number of licit and illicit drugs, and it's estimating their range between their ED50 and their LD50. And you see marijuana is on top. It says 0 to 1,000, but then if you look closely in white, the arrow simply says greater than 1,000. That's because we cannot cause lethal overdose in laboratory mice. We can administer them the high doses of cannabinoids as we want. We can induce dysphoria, but what we can't do is induce lethal overdose. Therefore, we cannot extrapolate what a lethal dosage would be in humans because we cannot create a lethal dose in animals. That's a fairly unusual statement to make, not only about a therapeutic substance, but virtually about any substance we consume. Ethanol, obviously, has lethal dose potential. Sodium has lethal dose potential. Caffeine has lethal dose potential. Even water has lethal dose potential. A person can drink enough water in one sitting to shut down their internal organs and die. But we do not see lethal dose potential with the cannabinoids. Again, as we go down the list, you see your illicit and illicit drugs. You see codeine, for instance, 20 to 1 safety ratio. 20 times the estimated therapeutic dose is estimated to kill 50% of the subjects who take the drug at that dose. Dextromethorphan, though, is the one I like to highlight. DXM, it's a cough suppressant. The active compound in Robitussin and Dimutab. In isolation, it's 10 to 1. 10 times the effective dose is estimated to kill 50% of the subjects that take the drug at that dose. That's in line with ethanol. That's why a person could line up 21 shots on their 21st birthday and literally drink themselves to death. Because these compounds have fairly low LD50s, which means they have very narrow safety profiles. But clearly, society is okay with that. Society is willing to accept both therapeutic agents and simply recreational intoxicants like alcohol if they have low LD50s and if they have narrow safety profiles. Clearly, cannabis has an infinite safety profile, so it clearly meets this criteria. The third and final question FDA is going to ask you, they're going to say, they want to know about the toxicity of your substance, and how does that play in the role of leading to significant adverse side effects? Toxicity has to do with how potentially dangerous or harmful is your substance to otherwise healthy cells and organs, typically in a dose-dependent manner. Higher the dose, greater the damage. The longer the use of the drug, greater the damage. When we talk about cannabis and the cannabinoids themselves, we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about toxicity. There may be some level of toxicity for not fully developed cells and organs. There may be some potential in individuals who are already compromised having some adverse effects with cannabis. But overall, toxicity is relatively low on the spectrum that we see from other therapeutic agents. And that's not surprising when you look at the laundry list of significant adverse side effects associated with FDA-approved drugs. There was a study done in Great Britain in 2011 where researchers looked at, they tallied the number of side effects right on the label of conventional therapeutics. And they said most commonly prescribed drugs average around 100 adverse side effects, and some drugs containing as many as 525 listed adverse reactions. Right on the label. Again, society is okay with this. We accept a litany of adverse side effects associated with therapeutic substances every day. And we know what these side effects are. We know the opiates, for instance, are getting a lot of attention these days regarding their risk of dependence and their overdose death risk. There's about 19,400 annual overdoses right now, every year in this country, due to the use of opioids. That sounds like a really big number until you realize there's almost that many overdose deaths associated with the use of NSAIDs in this country as well every year, just in patients that have gastrointestinal illnesses. Just in those patients. There's about 105,000 hospitalizations in this country every year due to the use of NSAIDs. But everyone wants to talk about opioids. We know that acetaminophen can cause liver toxicity and death. There's about 700 deaths every year attributed to the use of Tylenol. There's been 3 FDA warnings over the last decade or so with regard to the overprescription of Tylenol and making patients aware of the fact that Tylenol can have toxic effects. So again, we as a society, whether we're talking about opioids or Tylenol or NSAIDs or benzos or your serotonin reuptake inhibitors, we're okay accepting significant adverse side effects, including the risk of death as a side effect. By comparison, what are the commonly reported adverse effects of cannabis? Well, there's 3 or 4. Number 1 reported side effect is dry mouth. Number 2 is drowsiness. Patients in the trial say they get sleepy. Number 3 is very curious. This one comes up again and again. Euphoria. Patients said they felt better. That was jotted down adverse side effect. This is all very strange, but this is significant because when you talk to opponents of this issue, we can do these comparisons. We can say opioids, risk of death, acetaminophen, risk of death, NSAIDs, risk of stroke, heart attack, kidney failure, risk of death, marijuana, risk of dry mouth, euphoria. But then they pick up on that last one. They say, no, that's the problem. The problem is marijuana is mood altering. And I say, that's interesting. Because if suddenly the notion that a therapeutic substance alters mood is going to be a reason to not make that substance available, well, we have to change the entire pharmacopoeia. Because marijuana certainly is not alone in altering mood and being a therapeutic agent. In fact, the majority of therapeutic agents alter mood. The opioids most certainly alter mood. My wife had to go to the hospital some years ago. She was put on a morphine drip by the nurse. The nurse said, the doctor's going to be here in about 15 minutes, and when he comes in, explain to the doctor what's going on. My wife couldn't explain what planet we were on 5 minutes after that morphine drip was in her arm. That is an impairing drug. The benzodiazepines, the reason that family of drug exists is so people can alter their mood. That's why people take Valium. That's why they take Xanax. That's the point. The SSRIs, that's the point. That's why people take serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. Common cold medicines say right on the label, do not drive or operate heavy machinery until you become acclimated to the effects of this drug because it can impair one's performance. There was a study that came out earlier this year where they gave individuals acetaminophen and they showed them graphic images. And these individuals had a blunted emotional response to those images after they took acetaminophen as opposed to before they took the drug. Same thing with ibuprofen. Those drugs alter mood. That's what drugs do. And ultimately, what's the problem with that? In the case of cannabis, if we have a safe and effective therapeutic medication, and on top of that, it improves somebody's quality of life by making them want to get up in the morning and making them feel just a little bit better than they did the day before, how did that become problematic? When did that become defined as an adverse side effect anyway? So, after these lines of argument have failed, opponents like to fall on their sword and say, but here ultimately is the problem. We just don't know the long-term effects of cannabis. This is really interesting. When we were in our court case a couple of years ago, the federal government brought in one witness, and Bertha Madras, and she argued, we just don't have good long-term clinical trials on cannabis. And we said, how long is long-term? How many years of a clinical trial would you feel would be sufficient? And she looked us straight in the face, she looked the judge straight in the face, and she said 50 years. I practically laughed out loud in the courtroom. 50 years. Do you think when the FDA approves a new drug for the market, that drug's been tested on clinically for 50 years? You've got to be fucking kidding me. Anybody in this room know what the long-term effects are of statins? Anti-cholesterol drugs. You go on a statin, you're about 40, 45 with high cholesterol. You're going to be on it for the rest of your life. You don't get off it. You stay on it. Person lives to be 85. They start taking it at 45. They'll be taking it for 40 years. Anybody know what the effect of that drug is on the body if you take it every day for 40 years? No. Nobody knows. No one on planet Earth has taken that drug for 40 years every day. In 40 years, maybe we'll know. Maybe we'll find there's really significant toxic side effects if you take that drug every day for 40 years. Or maybe there won't be. But the answer is, we just don't know. We're not expected to know. The FDA doesn't demand anybody know the answer to those questions. This is, again, one of these distractions. But, fortunately, because human beings have been using cannabis, unlike statins, for thousands of years, we have this very unique situation where we actually can begin to assess what the long-term effects of the drug are. And on top of it, we do have clinical long-term studies. This was a study done in Israel. Israel has a medical marijuana program through the federal government. So it is quite common, particularly for elderly patients, to take cannabis regularly and be monitored by their doctor. This was a study that looked at patients with neuropathic pain who took cannabis daily for a 7-month period of time on average, and we found no issues with safety. We did establish efficacy, and we saw a 44% reduction in the patients' use of opioids that were in this cohort. Canada has a federal medical marijuana program. They've had one for many years. Again, there are many patients that have been in that system that are using cannabis and are approved to use cannabis and have been doing so for decades. This was an interesting observational case control study that was done looking at cancer patients who were in the Canadian medical marijuana program. They compared not only the efficacy of cannabis, but they looked at the safety profile of cannabis in these patients in Canada that are using marijuana every day versus matched cancer patients who weren't in the program who weren't using marijuana. And what they found was that the daily medical cannabis users possess no greater risk than non-users of experience any serious adverse events over a 1-year period. They found no adverse changes in consumers' cognition, pulmonary function, or blood work following 1 year daily use of cannabis consumption. And this is an interesting 2002 trial. As probably some people in this room know, the federal government has an extremely limited medical marijuana program. They ship 300 marijuana cigarettes throughout the country to a handful of patients. The marijuana is grown at the University of Mississippi. The cigarettes are rolled at the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina, and then the marijuana cigarettes are shipped to patients. And the federal government doesn't monitor these patients. They don't do any blood workup. They don't test their progress. They don't do anything with them. So a team of individual researchers said, we're going to do a complete blood workup of this unique cohort of patients who are essentially smoking 300 marijuana cigarettes a month and have been for decades. We're going to try and find out if there's anything wrong with their health. And what they found was no malignant deterioration, no neuropsychological or neurological deterioration, no endocrine, hematological, or immunological deterioration has been observed. This is probably the cohort, more so than any other people on this planet, who have the greatest exposure to smoked marijuana. And these physicians couldn't find anything wrong with them when they ran them through a battery of tests. And again, these are individuals who began using marijuana at this rate in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So they had several decades of daily marijuana use leading up to this trial. And most importantly, and this is what I really like to highlight, the Canadian Medical Journal published a review in 2008. They looked at 4 decades worth of clinical investigational trials involving cannabinoid drugs. And they wanted to see what percentage of subjects in those trials dropped out of the trial because of significant adverse side effects, things like toxicity to the liver. And what they found was that in 4 decades worth of trials, they couldn't find anybody who quit the trial because of complaining of a significant adverse side effect. What they did find was some people did quit because of what they reported to be insignificant adverse side effects. Things like dry mouth, cough, sleepiness, the things we were talking about earlier. But they couldn't find anyone who suffered a significant adverse side effect. 4 decades worth of clinical trials. Again, that is an amazing finding. And like I said earlier, in addition to this sort of clinical trial data, we also have the luxury of knowing that human beings have used this drug for thousands of years, providing us with ample empirical evidence as to its relative safety and efficacy. So then ultimately we're told, okay, Paul, you've got all these clinical trials, but you don't have enough. You don't have enough of those gold standard, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trials. I say, really? Because Ben Amar and his team did a meta-analysis in 2006, and they identified 72 controlled trials involving cannabis in different patient cohorts. And Franjo Grotenherman and his team in 2010 did another review, picking up where Amar left off, and they identified another 37 controlled trials. And then Igor Grant at UC San Diego, he reviewed just the clinical gold standard trials that were sponsored in the state of California through the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. And he said just based on those FDA-approved clinical trials alone, he said the Schedule I classification is not tenable, it is not accurate, that cannabis has no medical value, or that information is lacking. So here we have about 130, 140 gold standard clinical trials alone. Here's a whole bunch more that have come out since. We're talking about looking at chronic pain, transplants, healthcare utilization, epilepsy, diabetes, neuropathy, Parkinson's, a number of different subjects. But this is really the key. Some people might say, Paul, 130, 140 of those gold standard clinical trials, maybe that's just not enough. Maybe they just don't involve enough subjects. We hear this all the time. Well, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study recently, basically asking this question: what is adequate study before a drug can meet FDA approval? So they looked at the number of drugs approved by the FDA during a 7-year time period, from 2005 to 2012. And they found that during that period, the agency approved 188 new drugs. They said, we've seen enough of your research, we're convinced this drug is safe and effective, it should be used in the general population. The median number of those double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials that the FDA reviewed before it said, we've seen enough, was 2. And in over a third of the drugs approved by the FDA, they were approved on the basis of one single trial. Please don't tell me we don't have enough gold standard clinical trials about marijuana. Because you know what? We got a whole lot more than one. And sometimes that's clearly all it takes. Marinol, oral THC, was approved by the FDA in 1985 based on 2 clinical trials. 2. One of which involved a whole 167 patients. And because clinical trials are double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover trials, that typically means that if you have 160 patients, only 80 of them got the drug. Not a very large cohort. But that's the way drug production works. Cannabis simply isn't being held to the same standard. It's being held to an absurdly high theoretical standard that no other drugs are held up to, that no other drugs could even meet. We're told that no major health organizations support access to medical cannabis. That's simply false. We have very large major health organizations, the ANA, the Epilepsy Foundation, American Public Health Association, supporting marijuana and patients' immediate access to it. We're told there's no consensus among physicians. The DEA actually said this in their rejection of the Schedule I rescheduling petition 2 weeks ago. They said there's no consensus among the medical community. Really? Well, when WebMD polled physicians, they found 70% said that they believe cannabis possesses efficacy, and 67% said it ought to be legal. New England Journal of Medicine did their own poll in 2013. Over 3/4 of the respondents said, yeah, we'd recommend marijuana under this situation. What they're really saying, what opponents are really saying, is that the American Medical Association hasn't come out in support of the medical use of marijuana. To which case, I'd respond, so what? Is your doctor part of the AMA? Probably not, because only 15% of general practitioners in this country are members of the American Medical Association. And that number's been falling year by year by year by year. People might know the name, the AMA. The AMA doesn't hold a whole lot of clout anymore. No one really listens to the AMA. The AMA does not represent the views of current physicians. They'll say no medicine is smoked. This was interesting. I was doing a debate with a representative from Project SAM just last week. And of course this came up. I knew it would because they're like the monkey you wind and they just say the same thing over and over again. He said, no medicine is smoked. Doctors don't let people just decide the dose to take and to decide subjectively when they've taken enough. I said, really? They don't? I said, my son has asthma. When he has an asthma attack, you know what he does? He inhales his fucking medicine. He takes a bronchodilator and he sprays it in his mouth. And when he feels he's had adequate enough, he stops. We don't call the doctor and say, my son's having an asthma attack. How many doses, how many sprays should he take? We don't take him to the doctor's office so the doctor can observe how many sprays he takes. He trusts my son to know when enough is enough. And my son is 8. And the guy from Project SAM said, you know, I stand corrected. Yeah, you do. And besides, people don't have to smoke their medicine. As everyone in this room knows, there's other alternative routes of administration, including vaporization, that in a number of clinical trials, again, those gold standard clinical trials, have been shown to significantly cut down the risks associated with combustion while still maintaining rapid onset. Ultimately, of course, cannabis isn't approved by the FDA. And when the DEA made their decision to fail to reschedule, as anyone with any familiarity with the agency knew they would, they basically blamed the FDA. They said, look, the FDA didn't say marijuana is a medicine. Of course the FDA doesn't say marijuana is a medicine. And I don't want to sound like I'm beating up on the FDA here, I'm not. The reality is the FDA does not review botanical plants. They just don't. Name me a botanical plant that's FDA approved. Walk into GNC or any other health food store and go through that whole long aisle of dietary supplements. Your echinacea, your St. John's wort, your valerian root. And show me the one that's label that says this is FDA approved. There aren't any. That's not what FDA does. FDA reviews patented synthetic formulations of drugs developed by private companies like Merck and Eli Lilly, when they do their R&D, and they do their animal studies to get their LD50 and determine toxicity, and they do their 1 or 2 pivotal clinical trials on humans. That's what the FDA reviews. They don't review botanical plants. But if we were to hold cannabis up to the FDA review standards of safety and efficacy, clearly, as I've explained, cannabis not only meets those standards, it surpasses those standards. So in conclusion, 26 states and Washington, D.C. now, today, by statute, permit physicians to recommend marijuana therapy. In many cases, some of these state-sanctioned programs have been in place for nearly 2 decades. 4 states also now permit the adult use of marijuana, and about 1.5 million Americans are participating in these programs. At a minimum, we know enough about cannabis, as well as the failures of cannabis prohibition, to allow people the option to consume a botanical agent that is objectively safer than the litany of pharmaceutical and recreational substances it could replace. That is a statement of fact. I would be hard-pressed to find anyone who would provide a refutation to that statement. Here's some more resources for those that really want to dig into this and learn more. The National Academy of Sciences report, which I cited earlier, it's online. Your taxpayer dollars paid for it. I still maintain the federal government's final word on the subject, not that they've commissioned another one. The answer page is through Massachusetts Medical School and Harvard University. It is CME content about medical marijuana, but it's free to anyone who registers with the site. I provide content for that page. I really want to highlight this. The Emerging Clinical Applications for Cannabis. This is a publication that I wrote and update many year after year. It reviews about 250 of these preclinical and clinical studies I talked about. If you go onto the online version, we've embedded links to the abstracts of every one of those studies. I have some copies with me. We also have them at the NORML table. And then, of course, get your hands on the University of California Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. This, again, your tax dollars paid for it if you live in California. This was a $10.5 million research project sponsored by the state of California to do gold standard clinical trials on the safety and efficacy of cannabis. Cannabis showed to be safe and effective in every single trial the CMCR conducted. It's a very important study. Unfortunately, it's not even particularly talked about even in the state of California. I'll leave you with this. Carl Hart was a neuroscientist at Columbia University and was one of the experts in our case before the federal government. He wrote an excellent memoir. In that memoir, he says, "Those who know can no longer not know." Well, now all of you know, and because you know, you have an obligation to go back to your communities and share what you know with those who don't know. This plant isn't going to legalize itself. It needs all your help. Thank you, guys. I've got cards if anybody wants to chat with me in the hall. I'll be around all day.